Welcome to Catholic Culture Audiobooks, the only podcast bringing to life classic Catholic works through professional, high-quality audiobook recordings. Stay up to date with our latest podcast releases by signing up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/getaudio. Today's reading, Knowledge Viewed in Relation to Professional Skill, from The Idea of a University by St. John Henry Newman, narrated by James T. Majewski. I have been insisting, in my two preceding discourses, first on the cultivation of the intellect as an end which may reasonably be pursued for its own sake, and next on the nature of that cultivation, or what that cultivation consists in. Truth, of whatever kind, is the proper object of the intellect. Its cultivation, then, lies in fitting it to apprehend and contemplate truth. Now, the intellect, in its present state, with exceptions which need not here be specified, does not discern truth intuitively or as a whole. We know, not by a direct and simple vision, not at a glance, but, as it were, by piecemeal and accumulation, by a mental process, by going round an object, by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction, the continual adaptation of many partial notions, by the employment, concentration, and joint action of many faculties and exercises of mind. Such a union and concert of the intellectual powers, such an enlargement and development, such a comprehensiveness is necessarily a matter of training. And again, such a training is a matter of rule. It is not mere application, however exemplary, which introduces the mind to truth, nor the reading many books, nor the getting at many subjects, nor the witnessing many experiments, nor the attending many lectures. All this is short of enough. A man may have done it all, yet be lingering in the vestibule of knowledge. He may not realize what his mouth utters. He may not see with his mental eye what confronts him. He may have no grasp of things as they are, or at least he may have no power at all of advancing one step forward of himself in consequence of what he has already acquired, no power of discriminating between truth and falsehood, of sifting out the grains of truth from the mass, of arranging things according to their real value, and, if I may use the phrase, of building up ideas. Such a power is the result of a scientific formation of mind. It is an acquired faculty of judgment, of clear-sightedness, of sagacity, of wisdom, of philosophical reach of mind, and of intellectual self-possession and repose, qualities which do not come of mere acquirement. The bodily eye, the organ for apprehending material objects, is provided by nature. The eye of the mind, of which the object is truth, is the work of discipline and habit. This process of training, by which the intellect, instead of being formed or sacrificed to some particular or accidental purpose, some specific trade or profession or study or science, is disciplined for its own sake, for the perception of its own proper object, and for its own highest culture, is called liberal education. And though there is no one in whom it is carried as far as is conceivable, or whose intellect would be a pattern of what intellect should be made, yet there is scarcely anyone but may gain an idea of what real training is, and at least look towards it and make its true scope and result, not something else, his standard of excellence. And numbers there are who may submit themselves to it, and secure it to themselves in good measure. And to set forth the right standard, and to train according to it, and to help forward all students towards it according to their various capacities, this I conceive to be the business of a university. Now this is what some great men are very slow to allow. They insist that education should be confined to some particular and narrow end, and should issue in some definite work which can be weighed and measured. They argue as if every thing, as well as every person, had its price, and that where there has been a great outlay, they have a right to expect a return in kind. This they call making education and instruction useful, and utility becomes their watchword. With a fundamental principle of this nature, they very naturally go on to ask, what there is to show for the expense of a university. What is the real worth in the market of the article called a liberal education, on the supposition that it does not teach us definitely how to advance our manufactures, or to improve our lands, or to better our civil economy? Or again, if it does not at once make this man a lawyer, that an engineer, and that a surgeon, or at least if it does not lead to discoveries in chemistry, astronomy, geology, magnetism, and science of every kind. This question, as might have been expected, has been keenly debated in the present age, and formed one main subject of the controversy to which I referred in the introduction to the present discourses, as having been sustained in the first decade of this century by a celebrated Northern Review on the one hand, and defenders of the University of Oxford on the other. Hardly had the authorities of that ancient seat of learning, waking from their long neglect, set on foot a plan for the education of the youth committed to them, than the representatives of science and literature in the city, which has sometimes been called the Northern Athens, remonstrated with their gravest arguments and their most brilliant satire against the direction and shape which the reform was taking. Nothing would content them but that the university should be set to rights on the basis of the philosophy of utility, a philosophy, as they seem to have thought, which needed but to be proclaimed in order to be embraced. In truth, they were little aware of the depth and force of the principles on which the academical authorities were proceeding, and this being so, it was not to be expected that they would be allowed to walk at leisure over the field of controversy which they had selected. Accordingly, they were encountered in behalf of the university by two men of great name and influence in their day, of very different minds, but united as by collegiate ties, so in the clear-sighted and large view which they took of the whole subject of liberal education. And the defense thus provided for the Oxford studies has kept its ground to this day. Let me be allowed to devote a few words to the memory of distinguished persons under the shadow of whose name I once lived, and by whose doctrine I am now profiting. In the heart of Oxford, there is a small plot of ground, hemmed in by public thoroughfares, which has been the possession and the home of one society for above 500 years. In the old time of Boniface VIII and John the 22nd, in the age of Scotus and Occam and Dante, before Wycliffe or Huss had kindled those miserable fires which are still raging to the ruin of the highest interests of man, an unfortunate king of England, Edward II, flying from the field of Bannockburn, is said to have made a vow to the Blessed Virgin to found a religious house in her honor, if he got back in safety. Prompted and aided by his almoner, he decided on placing this house in the city of Alfred, and the image of Our Lady, which is opposite its entrance gate, is to this day the token of the vow and its fulfillment. King and almoner have long been in the dust, and strangers have entered into their inheritance, and their creed has been forgotten and their holy rites disowned. But day by day, a memento is still made in the holy sacrifice by at least one Catholic priest, once a member of that college, for the souls of those Catholic benefactors who fed him there for so many years. The visitor whose curiosity has been excited by its present fame gazes perhaps with something of disappointment on a collection of buildings which have with them so few of the circumstances of dignity or wealth. Broad quadrangles, high halls and chambers, ornamented cloisters, stately walks, or umbrageous gardens, a throng of students, ample revenues, or a glorious history, none of these things were the portion of that old Catholic foundation. Nothing, in short, which to the common eye 60 years ago would have given tokens of what it was to be. But it had at that time a spirit working within it, which enabled its inmates to do, amid its seeming insignificance, what no other body in the place could equal. Not a very abstruse gift or extraordinary boast, but a rare one, the honest purpose to administer the trust committed to them in such a way as their conscience pointed out as best. So whereas the colleges of Oxford are self-electing bodies, the fellows in each perpetually filling up for themselves the vacancies which occur in their number, the members of this foundation determined, at a time when, either from evil custom or from ancient statute, such a thing was not known elsewhere, to throw open their fellowships to the competition of all comers, and, in the choice of associates henceforth, to cast to the winds every personal motive and feeling, family connection and friendship, and patronage and political interest, and local claim and prejudice and party jealousy, and to elect solely on public and patriotic grounds. Nay, with a remarkable independence of mind, they resolved that even the table of honors, awarded to literary merit by the university in its new system of examination for degrees, should not fetter their judgment as electors, but that at all risks, and whatever criticism it might cause, and whatever odium they might incur, they would select the men, whoever they were, to be children of their founder, whom they thought in their consciences to be most likely from their intellectual and moral qualities to please him, if, as they expressed it, he were still upon earth, most likely to do honor to his college, most likely to promote the objects which they believed he had at heart. Such persons did not promise to be the disciples of a low utilitarianism, and consequently, as their collegiate reform synchronized with that reform of the academical body in which they bore a principal part, it was not unnatural that, when the storm broke upon the university from the north, their alma mater, whom they loved, should have found her first defenders within the walls of that small college, which had first put itself into a condition to be her champion. These defenders, I have said, were two, of whom the more distinguished was the late Dr. Copleston, then a fellow of the college, successively its provost, and Protestant Bishop of Llandaff. In that society, which owes so much to him, his name lives and ever will live, for the distinction which his talents bestowed on it, for the academical importance to which he raised it, for the generosity of spirit, the liberality of sentiment, and the kindness of heart with which he adorned it, and which even those who had least sympathy with some aspects of his mind and character could not but admire and love. Men come to their meridian at various periods of their lives. The last years of the eminent person I am speaking of were given to duties which, I am told, have been the means of endearing him to numbers, but which afforded no scope for that peculiar vigor and keenness of mind which enabled him, when a young man, single-handed with easy gallantry, to encounter and overthrow the charge of 3 giants of the north combined against him. I believe I am right in saying that, in the progress of the controversy, the most scientific, the most critical, and the most witty of that literary company, all of them now as he himself, removed from this visible scene, Professor Playfair, Lord Jeffrey, and the Reverend Sidney Smith, threw together their several efforts into one article of their review in order to crush and pound to dust the audacious controvertist who had come out against them in defense of his own institutions. To have even contended with such men was a sufficient voucher for his ability, even before we open his pamphlets, and have actual evidence of the good sense, the spirit, the scholar-like taste, and the purity of style by which they are distinguished. He was supported in the controversy on the same general principles, but with more of method and distinctness, and I will add with greater force and beauty and perfection, both of thought and of language, by the other distinguished writer to whom I have already referred, Mr. Davison, who, though not so well known to the world in his day, has left more behind him than the provost of Oriel, to make his name remembered by posterity. This thoughtful man, who was the admired and intimate friend of a very remarkable person whom, whether he wish it or not, numbers revere and love as the first author of the subsequent movement in the Protestant Church toward Catholicism, this grave and philosophical writer, whose works I can never look into without sighing that such a man was lost to the Catholic Church, as Dr. Butler before him, by some early bias or some fault of self-education, he, in a review of a work by Mr. Edgeworth on professional education, which attracted a good deal of attention in its day, goes leisurely over the same ground which had already been rapidly traversed by Dr. Copleston, and, though professedly employed upon Mr. Edgeworth, is really replying to the northern critic who had brought that writer's work into notice, and to a far greater author than either of them, who in a past age had argued on the same side. The author to whom I allude is no other than Locke. That celebrated philosopher has preceded the Edinburgh reviewers in condemning the ordinary subjects in which boys are instructed at school, on the ground that they are not needed by them in after life. And before quoting what his disciples have said in the present century, I will refer to a few passages of the master. "'Tis matter of astonishment," he says in his work on education, that men of quality and parts should suffer themselves to be so far misled by custom and implicit faith. Reason, if consulted with, would advise that their children's time should be spent in acquiring what might be useful to them when they come to be men, rather than that their heads should be stuffed with a deal of trash, a great part whereof they usually never do, 'tis certain they never need to, think on again as long as they live, and so much of it as does stick by them they are only the worse for. And so again, speaking of verse-making, he says, I know not what reason a father can have to wish his son a poet, who does not desire him to bid defiance to all other calling and business, which is not yet the worst of the case, for if he proves a successful rhymer, and gets once the reputation of a wit, I desire it to be considered what company and places he is likely to spend his time in, nay, and estate too, for it is very seldom seen that any one discovers mines of gold or silver in Parnassus. 'Tis a pleasant air, but a barren soil. In another passage, he distinctly limits utility in education to its bearing on the future profession or trade of the pupil. That is, he scorns the idea of any education of the intellect simply as such. Can there be anything more ridiculous, he asks, than that a father should waste his own money and his son's time in setting him to learn the Roman language, when at the same time he designs him for a trade, wherein he, having no use of Latin, fails not to forget that little which he brought from school, and which 'tis 10 to 1 he abhors for the ill usage it procured him? Could it be believed, unless we have everywhere amongst us examples of it, that a child should be forced to learn the rudiments of a language which he is never to use in the course of life that he is designed to, and neglect all the while the writing a good hand and casting accounts, which are of great advantage in all conditions of life, and most trades indispensably necessary? Nothing, of course, can be more absurd than to neglect in education those matters which are necessary for a boy's future calling. But the tone of Locke's remarks evidently implies more than this, and is condemnatory of any teaching which tends to the general cultivation of the mind. Now to turn to his modern disciples. The study of the classics had been made the basis of the Oxford education in the reforms which I have spoken of, and the Edinburgh reviewers protested, after the manner of Locke, that no good could come of a system which was not based upon the principle of utility. Classical literature, they said, is the great object at Oxford. Many minds so employed have produced many works and much fame in that department. But if all liberal arts and sciences useful to human life had been taught there, if some had dedicated themselves to chemistry, some to mathematics, some to experimental philosophy, and if every attainment had been honored in the mixed ratio of its difficulty and utility, the system of such a university would have been much more valuable, but the splendor of its name something less. Utility may be made the end of education in two respects, either as regards the individual educated or the community at large. In which light do these writers regard it? In the latter. So far they differ from Locke, for they consider the advancement of science as the supreme and real end of a university. This is brought into view in the sentences which follow. When a university has been doing useless things for a long time, it appears at first degrading to them to be useful. A set of lectures on political economy would be discouraged in Oxford, probably despised, probably not permitted. To discuss the enclosure of commons, and to dwell upon imports and exports, to come so near to common life, would seem to be undignified and contemptible. In the same manner, the Parr or the Bentley of the day would be scandalized in a university, to be put on a level with the discoverer of a neutral salt. And yet, what other measure is there of dignity in intellectual labor but usefulness? And what ought the term university to mean but a place where every science is taught which is liberal and at the same time useful to mankind? Nothing would so much tend to bring classical literature within proper bounds as a steady and invariable appeal to utility in our appreciation of all human knowledge. Looking always to real utility as our guide, we should see, with equal pleasure, a studious and inquisitive mind arranging the productions of nature, investigating the qualities of bodies, or mastering the difficulties of the learned languages. We should not care whether he was chemist, naturalist, or scholar, because we know it to be as necessary that matter should be studied and subdued to the use of man, as that taste should be gratified and imagination inflamed. Such, then, is the enunciation, as far as words go, of the theory of utility in education, and both on its own account and for the sake of the able men who have advocated it, it has a claim on the attention of those whose principles I am here representing. Certainly it is specious to contend that nothing is worth pursuing but what is useful, and that life is not long enough to expend upon interesting or curious or brilliant trifles. Nay, in one sense I will grant it is more than specious. It is true. But if so, how do I propose directly to meet the objection? Why, gentlemen, I have really met it already, namely, in laying down that intellectual culture is its own end. For what has its end in itself has its use in itself also. I say, if a liberal education consists in the culture of the intellect, and if that culture be in itself a good, here, without going further, is an answer to Locke's question. For if a healthy body is a good in itself, why is not a healthy intellect? And if a college of physicians is a useful institution because it contemplates bodily health, why is not an academical body, though it were simply and solely engaged in imparting vigor and beauty and grasp to the intellectual portion of our nature? And the reviewers I am quoting seem to allow this in their better moments, in a passage which, putting aside the question of its justice in fact, is sound and true in the principles to which it appeals. The present state of classical education, they say, cultivates the imagination a great deal too much, and other habits of mind a great deal too little, and trains up many young men in a style of elegant imbecility utterly unworthy of the talents with which nature has endowed them. The matter of fact is, that a classical scholar of 23 or 24 is a man principally conversant with works of imagination. His feelings are quick, his fancy lively, and his taste good. Talents for speculation and original inquiry he has none, nor has he formed the invaluable habit of pushing things up to their first principles, or of collecting dry and unamusing facts as the materials for reasoning. All the solid and masculine parts of his understanding are left wholly without cultivation. He hates the pain of thinking, and suspects every man whose boldness and originality call upon him to defend his opinions and prove his assertions. Now, I am not at present concerned with the specific question of classical education, else I might reasonably question the justice of calling an intellectual discipline, which embraces the study of Aristotle, Thucydides, and Tacitus, which involves scholarship and antiquities, imaginative. Still, so far I readily grant that the cultivation of the understanding, of a talent for speculation and original inquiry, and of the habit of pushing things up to their first principles is a principal portion of a good or liberal education. If then the reviewers consider such cultivation the characteristic of a useful education, as they seem to do in the foregoing passage, it follows that what they mean by useful is just what I mean by good or liberal, and Locke's question becomes a verbal one. Whether youths are to be taught Latin or verse-making will depend on the fact whether these studies tend to mental culture. But however this is determined, so far is clear, that in that mental culture consists what I have called a liberal or non-professional and what the reviewers call a useful education. This is the obvious answer which may be made to those who urge upon us the claims of utility in our plans of education. But I am not going to leave the subject here. I mean to take a wider view of it. Let us take useful as Locke takes it, in its proper and popular sense, and then we enter upon a large field of thought to which I cannot do justice in one discourse, though today's is all the space that I can give to it. I say, let us take useful to mean, not what is simply good, but what tends to good, or is the instrument of good. And in this sense also, gentlemen, I will show you how a liberal education is truly and fully a useful, though it be not a professional, education. Good, indeed, means one thing, and useful means another. But I lay it down as a principle, which will save us a great deal of anxiety, that though the useful is not always good, the good is always useful. Good is not only good, but reproductive of good. This is one of its attributes. Nothing is excellent, beautiful, perfect, desirable for its own sake, but it overflows and spreads the likeness of itself all around it. Good is prolific. It is not only good to the eye, but to the taste. It not only attracts us, but it communicates itself. It excites first our admiration and love, then our desire and our gratitude, and that in proportion to its intenseness and fullness in particular instances. A great good will impart great good. If then the intellect is so excellent a portion of us, and its cultivation so excellent, it is not only beautiful, perfect, admirable, and noble in itself, but in a true and high sense it must be useful to the possessor and to all around him. Not useful in any low, mechanical, mercantile sense, but as diffusing good, or as a blessing, or a gift, or power, or a treasure, first to the owner, then through him to the world. I say then, if a liberal education be good, it must necessarily be useful too. You will see what I mean by the parallel of bodily health. Health is a good in itself, though nothing came of it, and is especially worth seeking and cherishing. Yet, after all, the blessings which attend its presence are so great, while they are so close to it and so redound back upon it and encircle it, that we never think of it except as useful as well as good, and praise and prize it for what it does as well as for what it is, though at the same time we cannot point out any definite and distinct work or production which it can be said to effect. And so, as regards intellectual culture, I am far from denying utility in this large sense as the end of education when I lay it down that the culture of the intellect is a good in itself and its own end. I do not exclude from the idea of intellectual culture what it cannot but be from the very nature of things. I only deny that we must be able to point out, before we have any right to call it useful, some art or business or profession or trade or work as resulting from it, and as its real and complete end. The parallel is exact. As the body may be sacrificed to some manual or other toil, whether moderate or oppressive, so may the intellect be devoted to some specific profession, and I do not call this the culture of the intellect. Again, as some member or organ of the body may be inordinately used and developed, so may memory or imagination or the reasoning faculty. And this, again, is not intellectual culture. On the other hand, as the body may be tended, cherished, and exercised with a simple view to its general health, so may the intellect also be generally exercised in order to its perfect state, and this is its cultivation. Again, as health ought to precede labor of the body, and as a man in health can do what an unhealthy man cannot do, and as of this health the properties are strength, energy, agility, graceful carriage and action, manual dexterity, and endurance of fatigue, so in like manner general culture of mind is the best aid to professional and scientific study, and educated men can do what illiterate cannot. And the man who has learned to think and to reason and to compare and to discriminate and to analyze, who has refined his taste and formed his judgment and sharpened his mental vision, will not indeed at once be a lawyer or a pleader or an orator or a statesman or a physician or a good landlord or a man of business or a soldier or an engineer or a chemist or a geologist or an antiquarian, but he will be placed in that state of intellect in which he can take up any one of the sciences or callings I have referred to, or any other for which he has a taste or special talent, with an ease, a grace, a versatility, and a success to which another is a stranger. In this sense, then, and as yet I have said but a very few words on a large subject, mental culture is emphatically useful. If then I am arguing, and shall argue, against professional or scientific knowledge as the sufficient end of a university education, let me not be supposed, gentlemen, to be disrespectful towards particular studies, or arts, or vocations, and those who are engaged in them. In saying that law or medicine is not the end of a university course, I do not mean to imply that the university does not teach law or medicine. What indeed can it teach at all if it does not teach something particular? It teaches all knowledge by teaching all branches of knowledge, and in no other way. I do but say that there will be this distinction as regards a professor of law, or of medicine, or of geology, or of political economy, in a university and out of it, that out of a university he is in danger of being absorbed and narrowed by his pursuit, and of giving lectures which are the lectures of nothing more than a lawyer, physician, geologist, or political economist. Whereas in a university, he will just know where he and his science stand. He has come to it, as it were, from a height. He has taken a survey of all knowledge. He is kept from extravagance by the very rivalry of other studies. He has gained from them a special illumination and largeness of mind, and freedom and self-possession, and he treats his own in consequence with a philosophy and a resource which belongs not to the study itself, but to his liberal education. This, then, is how I should solve the fallacy, for so I must call it, by which Locke and his disciples would frighten us from cultivating the intellect under the notion that no education is useful which does not teach us some temporal calling, or some mechanical art, or some physical secret. I say that a cultivated intellect, because it is a good in itself, brings with it a power and a grace to every work and occupation which it undertakes, and enables us to be more useful and to a greater number. There is a duty we owe to human society as such, to the state to which we belong, to the sphere in which we move, to the individuals towards whom we are variously related and whom we successively encounter in life. And that philosophical or liberal education, as I have called it, which is the proper function of a university, if it refuses the foremost place to professional interests, does but postpone them to the formation of the citizen, and while it subserves the larger interests of philanthropy, prepares also for the successful prosecution of those merely personal objects which at first sight it seems to disparage. And now, gentlemen, I wish to be allowed to enforce in detail what I have been saying by some extracts from the writings to which I have already alluded, and to which I am so greatly indebted. It is an undisputed maxim in political economy, says Dr. Copleston, that the separation of professions and the division of labor tend to the perfection of every art, to the wealth of nations, to the general comfort and well-being of the community. This principle of division is in some instances pursued so far as to excite the wonder of people to whose notice it is for the first time pointed out. There is no saying to what extent it may not be carried, and the more the powers of each individual are concentrated in one employment, the greater skill and quickness will he naturally display in performing it. But while he thus contributes more effectually to the accumulation of national wealth, he becomes himself more and more degraded as a rational being. In proportion as his sphere of action is narrowed, his mental powers and habits become contracted, and he resembles a subordinate part of some powerful machinery, useful in its place, but insignificant and worthless out of it. If it be necessary, as it is beyond all question necessary, that society should be split into divisions and subdivisions, in order that its several duties may be well performed, yet we must be careful not to yield up ourselves wholly and exclusively to the guidance of this system. We must observe what its evils are, and we should modify and restrain it by bringing into action other principles which may serve as a check and counterpoise to the main force. There can be no doubt that every art is improved by confining the professor of it to that single study, but although the art itself is advanced by this concentration of mind in its service, the individual who is confined to it goes back. The advantage of the community is nearly in an inverse ratio with his own. Society itself requires some other contribution from each individual, besides the particular duties of his profession. and if no such liberal intercourse be established, it is the common failing of human nature to be engrossed with petty views and interests, to underrate the importance of all in which we are not concerned, and to carry our partial notions into cases where they are inapplicable, to act, in short, as so many unconnected units, displacing and repelling one another. In the cultivation of literature is found that common link which, among the higher and middling departments of life, unites the jarring sects and subdivisions into one interest, which supplies common topics and kindles common feelings, unmixed with those narrow prejudices with which all professions are more or less infected. The knowledge, too, which is thus acquired, expands and enlarges the mind, excites its faculties, and calls those limbs and muscles into freer exercise which, by too constant use in one direction, not only acquire an illiberal air, but are apt also to lose somewhat of their native play and energy. And thus, without directly qualifying a man for any of the employments of life, it enriches and ennobles all. Without teaching him the peculiar business of any one office or calling, it enables him to act his part in each of them with better grace and more elevated carriage, and if happily planned and conducted, is a main ingredient in that complete and generous education which fits a man to perform justly, skilfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war. The view of liberal education advocated in these extracts is expanded by Mr. Davison in the essay to which I have already referred. He lays more stress on the usefulness of liberal education in the larger sense of the word than his predecessor in the controversy. Instead of arguing that the utility of knowledge to the individual varies inversely with its utility to the public, he chiefly employs himself on the suggestions contained in Dr. Copleston's last sentences. He shows first that a liberal education is something far higher, even in the scale of utility, than what is commonly called a useful education, and next, that it is necessary or useful for the purposes even of that professional education which commonly engrosses the title of useful. The former of these two theses he recommends to us in an argument from which the following passages are selected. It is to take a very contracted view of life, he says, to think with great anxiety how persons may be educated to superior skill in their department, comparatively neglecting or excluding the more liberal and enlarged cultivation. In his, Mr. Edgeworth's, system, the value of every attainment is to be measured by its subserviency to a calling. The specific duties of that calling are exalted at the cost of those free and independent tastes and virtues which come in to sustain the common relations of society and raise the individual in them. In short, a man is to be usurped by his profession. He is to be clothed in its garb from head to foot. His virtues, his science, and his ideas are all to be put into a gown or uniform, and the whole man to be shaped, pressed, and stiffened in the exact mold of his technical character. Any interloping accomplishments, or a faculty which cannot be taken into public pay, if they are to be indulged in him at all, must creep along under the cloak of his more serviceable, privileged merits. Such is the state of perfection to which the spirit and general tendency of this system would lead us. But the professional character is not the only one which a person engaged in a profession has to support. He is not always upon duty. There are services he owes which are neither parochial, nor forensic, nor military, nor to be described by any such epithet of civil regulation, and yet are in no wise inferior to those that bear these authoritative titles. Inferior neither in their intrinsic value, nor their moral import, nor their impression upon society. As a friend, as a companion, as a citizen at large, in the connections of domestic life, in the improvement and embellishment of his leisure, he has a sphere of action, revolving, if you please, within the sphere of his profession, but not clashing with it, in which, if he can show none of the advantages of an improved understanding, whatever may be his skill or proficiency in the other, he is no more than an ill-educated man. There is a certain faculty in which all nations of any refinement are great practitioners. It is not taught at school or college as a distinct science, though it deserves that what is taught there should be made to have some reference to it. Nor is it endowed at all by the public. everybody being obliged to exercise it for himself in person, which he does to the best of his skill. But in nothing is there a greater difference than in the manner of doing it. The advocates of professional learning will smile when we tell them that this same faculty which we would have encouraged is simply that of speaking good sense in English without fee or reward in common conversation. They will smile when we lay some stress upon it, but in reality it is no such trifle as they imagine. Look into the huts of savages and see, for there is nothing to listen to, the dismal blank of their stupid hours of silence. Their professional avocations of war and hunting are over, and, having nothing to do, they have nothing to say. Turn to improved life, and you find conversation in all its forms the medium of something more than an idle pleasure. Indeed, a very active agent in circulating and forming the opinions, tastes, and feelings of a whole people. It makes of itself a considerable affair. Its topics are the most promiscuous, all those which do not belong to any particular province. As for its power and influence, we may fairly say that it is of just the same consequence to a man's immediate society how he talks as how he acts. Now, of all those who furnish their share to rational conversation, a mere adept in his own art is universally admitted to be the worst. The sterility and uninstructiveness of such a person's social hours are quite proverbial. Or if he escape being dull, it is only by launching into ill-tuned, learned loquacity. We do not desire of him lectures or speeches, and he has nothing else to give. Among benches he may be powerful, but seated on a chair he is quite another person. On the other hand, we may affirm that one of the best companions is a man who, to the accuracy and research of a profession, has joined a free excursive acquaintance with various learning, and caught from it the spirit of general observation. Having thus shown that a liberal education is a real benefit to the subjects of it as members of society in the various duties and circumstances and accidents of life, he goes on, in the next place, to show that, over and above those direct services which might fairly be expected of it, it actually subserves the discharge of those particular functions and the pursuit of those particular advantages which are connected with professional exertion, and to which professional education is directed. We admit, he observes, that when a person makes a business of one pursuit, he is in the right way to eminence in it, and that divided attention will rarely give excellence in many. But our assent will go no further, for to think that the way to prepare a person for excelling in any one pursuit, and that is the only point in hand, is to fetter his early studies and cramp the first development of his mind by a reference to the exigencies of that pursuit barely, is a very different notion, and one which, we apprehend, deserves to be exploded rather than received. Possibly a few of the abstract, insulated kinds of learning might be approached in that way. The exceptions to be made are very few, and need not be recited. But for the acquisition of professional and practical ability, such maxims are death to it. The main ingredients of that ability are requisite knowledge and cultivated faculties, but of the two, the latter is by far the chief. A man of well-improved faculties has the command of another's knowledge. A man without them has not the command of his own. Of the intellectual powers, the judgment is that which takes the foremost lead in life. How to form it to the two habits it ought to possess, of exactness and vigor, is the problem. It would be ignorant presumption so much as to hint at any routine of method by which these qualities may with certainty be imparted to every or any understanding. Still, however, we may safely lay it down that they are not to be got by a gatherer of simples, but are the combined essence and extracts of many different things, drawn from much varied reading and discipline first, and observation afterwards. For if there be a single intelligible point on this head, it is that a man who has been trained to think upon one subject, or for one subject only, will never be a good judge even in that one, whereas the enlargement of his circle gives him increased knowledge and power in a rapidly increasing ratio. So much do ideas act, not as solitary units, but by grouping and combination. And so clearly do all the things that fall within the proper province of the same faculty of the mind intertwine with and support each other. Judgment lives, as it were, by comparison and discrimination. Can it be doubted, then, whether the range and extent of that assemblage of things upon which it is practiced in its first essays are of use to its power? To open our way a little further on this matter, we will define what we mean by the power of judgment, and then try to ascertain among what kind of studies the improvement of it may be expected at all. Judgment does not stand here for a certain homely, useful quality of intellect that guards a person from committing mistakes to the injury of his fortunes or common reputation, but for that master principle of business, literature, and talent, which gives him strength in any subject he chooses to grapple with and enables him to seize the strong point in it. Whether this definition be metaphysically correct or not, it comes home to the substance of our inquiry. It describes the power that everyone desires to possess when he comes to act in a profession or elsewhere, and corresponds with our best idea of a cultivated mind. Next, it will not be denied that in order to do any good to the judgment, the mind must be employed upon such subjects as come within the cognizance of that faculty, and give some real exercise to its perceptions. Here we have a rule of selection by which the different parts of learning may be classed for our purpose. Those which belong to the province of the judgment are religion in its evidences and interpretation, ethics, history, eloquence, poetry, theories of general speculation, the fine arts, and works of wit. Great as the variety of these large divisions of learning may appear, they are all held in union by two capital principles of connection. First, they are all quarried out of one and the same great subject of man's moral, social, and feeling nature, and secondly, they are all under the control, more or less strict, of the same power of moral reason. If these studies, he continues, be such as give a direct play and exercise to the faculty of the judgment, then they are the true basis of education for the active and inventive powers, whether destined for a profession or any other use. Miscellaneous as the assemblage may appear, of history, eloquence, poetry, ethics, etc., blended together they will all conspire in a union of effect. They are necessarily mutually to explain and interpret each other. The knowledge derived from them all will amalgamate, and the habits of a mind versed and practiced in them by turns will join to produce a richer vein of thought and of more general and practical application than could be obtained of any single one, as the fusion of the metals in Corinthian brass gave the artist his most ductile and perfect material. Might we venture to imitate an author, whom indeed it is much safer to take as an authority than to attempt to copy, Lord Bacon, in some of his concise illustrations of the comparative utility of the different studies, we should say that history would give fullness, moral philosophy strength, and poetry elevation to the understanding. Such, in reality, is the natural force and tendency of the studies. But there are few minds susceptible enough to derive from them any sort of virtue adequate to those high expressions. We must be contented, therefore, to lower our panegyric to this, that a person cannot avoid receiving some infusion and tincture at least of those several qualities from that course of diversified reading. One thing is unquestionable, that the elements of general reason are not to be found fully and truly expressed in any one kind of study, and that he who would wish to know her idiom must read it in many books. If different studies are useful for aiding, they are still more useful for correcting each other. For as they have their particular merits severally, so they have their defects, and the most extensive acquaintance with one can produce only an intellect either too flashy or too jejune, or infected with some other fault of confined reading. History, for example, shows things as they are, that is, the morals and interests of men disfigured and perverted by all their imperfections of passion, folly, and ambition. Philosophy strips the picture too much. Poetry adorns it too much. The concentrated lights of the three correct the false peculiar coloring of each, and show us the truth. The right mode of thinking upon it is to be had from them taken all together, as everyone must know who has seen their united contributions of thought and feeling expressed in the masculine sentiment of our immortal statesman, Mr. Burke, whose eloquence is inferior only to his more admirable wisdom. If any mind improved like his is to be our instructor, we must go to the fountain-head of things as he did, and study not his works, but his method. By the one we may become feeble imitators, by the other arrive at some ability of our own. But as all biography assures us, he and every other able thinker has been formed not by a parsimonious admeasurement of studies to some definite future object, which is Mr. Edgeworth's maxim, but by taking a wide and liberal compass, and thinking a great deal on many subjects with no better end in view than because the exercise was one which made them more rational and intelligent beings. But I must bring these extracts to an end. Today I have confined myself to saying that training of the intellect, which is best for the individual himself, best enables him to discharge his duties to society. The philosopher, indeed, and the man of the world differ in their very notion, but the methods by which they are respectively formed are pretty much the same. The philosopher has the same command of matters of thought which the true citizen and gentleman has of matters of business and conduct. If, then, a practical end must be assigned to a university course, I say it is that of training good members of society. Its art is the art of social life, and its end is fitness for the world. It neither confines its views to particular professions on the one hand, nor creates heroes or inspires genius on the other. Works indeed of genius fall under no art. Heroic minds come under no rule. A university is not a birthplace of poets or of immortal authors, of founders of schools, leaders of colonies, or conquerors of nations. It does not promise a generation of Aristotles or Newtons, of Napoleons or Washingtons, of Raphaels or Shakespeares, though such miracles of nature it has before now contained within its precincts. Nor is it content, on the other hand, with forming the critic or the experimentalist, the economist or the engineer, though such too it includes within its scope. But a university training is the great ordinary means to a great but ordinary end. It aims at raising the intellectual tone of society, at cultivating the public mind, at purifying the national taste, at supplying true principles to popular enthusiasm and fixed aims to popular aspiration, at giving enlargement and sobriety to the ideas of the age, at facilitating the exercise of political power and refining the intercourse of private life. It is the education which gives a man a clear, conscious view of his own opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. It teaches him to see things as they are, to go right to the point, to disentangle a skein of thought, to detect what is sophistical and to discard what is irrelevant. It prepares him to fill any post with credit, and to master any subject with facility. It shows him how to accommodate himself to others, how to throw himself into their state of mind, how to bring before them his own, how to influence them, how to come to an understanding with them, how to bear with them. He is at home in any society. He has common ground with every class. He knows when to speak and when to be silent. He is able to converse. He is able to listen. He can ask a question pertinently and gain a lesson seasonably when he has nothing to impart himself. He is ever ready, yet never in the way. He is a pleasant companion and a comrade you can depend upon. He knows when to be serious and when to trifle, and he has a sure tact which enables him to trifle with gracefulness and to be serious with effect. He has the repose of a mind which lives in itself while it lives in the world, and which has resources for its happiness at home when it cannot go abroad. He has a gift which serves him in public and supports him in retirement, without which good fortune is but vulgar, and with which failure and disappointment have a charm. The art which tends to make a man all this is, in the object which it pursues, as useful as the art of wealth or the art of health, though it is less susceptible of method, and less tangible, less certain, less complete in its result. This has been Knowledge Viewed in Relation to Professional Skill from The Idea of a University by St. John Henry Newman, narrated by James T. Majewski. Production copyright 2023 by Trinity Communications. This podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and more at CatholicCulture.org.